Making a platteville Gel 25 full head cast. Don't let the order fool you. Even though this is the first cast we're going to show on this DVD, this is the most complicated. But we want to cover this first because everything else is downhill, and the concepts used on making a successful full head cast in silicone are important to all the other processes we'll cover on this DVD. Now we're going to show a little different approach than a traditional head cast for this DVD. Previously you might have seen silicone life casts being done with vinyl caps or with well-released silicone bald caps. Traditionally vinyl caps are used because they don't have any contaminants that can interfere with the platinum silicone chemistry. In some cases we've used latex caps provided they're well released with Vaseline, but in this case we're actually going to start off by making a Gel 25 bald cap, and the Gel 25 bald cap will actually be absorbed into the cast later on, and that'll make more sense as you watch the rest of this process. We're going to use a red head a bald cap form, and we're going to brush on some platteville Gel 25. Now Gel 25 is 1-to-1 mix ratio by weight or volume, and so anytime we're working in really small amounts or even large amounts for that matter, but especially small amounts, I like to weigh it out, and that minimizes waste and just increases the accuracy. Anytime you're working in small batches, it's real easy if you're in a hurry to wind up off ratio when you're eyeballing those graduated marks on the side of the container. So when in doubt, revert to the weight ratio just to minimize waste, and you'll find out with practice you can do this pretty fast with a good gram scale. Now to create our Gel 25 bald cap, we only need a few ounces of Gel 25. Here we're mixing up about 40 grams of platteville Gel 25, and I'm adding some yellow silicone pigment, and that will help the contrast later on. You don't have to do this step, but when you see how this all works together with the finished cast, a contrasting color really helps out in this stage. Now the other thing we're going to add is a small amount of Tin Thicks thickener. Just a few drops of Tin Thicks thickener will make this more of a paste consistency, and you'll see us use that trick throughout this DVD. Anytime we want to create a brushable paste, we add Tin Thicks to the formula. Now we're going to brush this over our red head to create our cap, and if you've used your cap a lot for latex caps, it's a good idea to wipe it down really good with acetone before you start this process to remove any latex residue that might cause problems with the silicone curing. Now once we've mixed up our Gel 25, ready to brush that onto our head form. And another point here to remember is throughout this DVD we'll be applying Gel 25 using chip brushes or throwaway brushes. That's important because there's no way that I'm aware of cleaning cured silicone out of a brush like this. So make sure you're using brushes that you'll be ready to throw away later on. Don't use expensive artist brushes. Just use brushes that are merely a tool to apply it to your subject. And avoid really cheap brushes or foam brushes and things like that you'll have difficulty using to spread that thick silicone onto your subject. So when in doubt, just use these chip brushes. These are some that we supply on our web store. These are just cheap natural bristle brushes, and they're throwaway brushes. So as soon as you're done using it, toss it in the trash can, and they're cheap enough you won't feel any guilt for throwing them away. Now we're building this up in 2 layers. So once we've coated our cap, we're going to let that set for about 30 minutes and then come back with one more coat. And it's important to move along pretty quick. Anytime you're brushing up layers of silicone, to ensure that you get a good bond, you want to come back on top of that layer as soon as possible to make sure that you get a good bond between layers. Now one way you can make sure you're ready to progress is based on the leftover silicone in the cup. And you notice I was tapping that to check and see if it was cured. When that is cured to where your finger doesn't remove any silicone by touching it, you're ready to move on with the next layer. And once we built up 2 layers, usually 2 layers is sufficient for this kind of cap. We're ready to allow it to cure for another hour and a half or so, and then we'll be ready to peel it off of our head form. Now it'll take a little bit longer for Gel 25 to cure over an inanimate object like this than it does on a life cast. Anytime you're life casting with Gel 25, the body heat of your subject will act as an accelerant. Now, a good way to gauge when your Gel 25 has completely cured is when you can pull it out of the mixing cup like that and it all comes out in one piece. That's also a good way to grade your mixing work. Now, we're going to use an X-Acto here to cut away any of the excess cap material and cut out where our subject's face will be. If you're familiar with latex or vinyl bald caps, you know the general shape of that pattern. And now we're ready to carefully peel this off of our form. And now we have our cured Gel 25 bald cap ready to apply to our subject. Now, the way you can stick this kind of cap down is with a variety of silicone adhesives like Snappy G or the new Silky adhesive. But in this case, what I like to do to glue these kind of caps down, because we actually want this to be able to peel up fairly easy later on, because we're going to want this cap to stay with the cast rather than stay on the subject's head. So what I do is we're applying this much the way we would a vinyl cap or a latex cap by putting it on the subject and marking the hairline, and then peeling it off, cutting the excess away, and then putting it back on and gluing it down. We're going to do all those steps the same as we would a standard bald cap application, except I usually mix up a little bit of thickened gel 10 or a little bit of thickened gel 25 and use that as an adhesive to stick the cap down. Now, this particular cap method is different than a traditional cap in a lot of ways, that we would normally release the entire subject, the subject's skin and the bald cap. But in this case, we're actually only going to release the subject just from the cap down. And it's important anytime you're making a silicone life cast, even though silicone doesn't have any adhesive properties, Gel 25 can get caught up in fine hair on your subject. So it's a good idea, in addition to just an overall layer of Vaseline all over your subject, to make sure that you release their eyelashes and their eyebrows and any other short facial hair very well. And I recommend that you do not attempt to mold facial hair longer than about 1/4 of an inch. And you'll notice here's a quick graphic explaining everywhere that orange color is where we want our Vaseline applied. We don't want to apply it to the cap because, again, we actually want the cap to transfer to the finished life cast. And again, this is a kind of technique. This is a little different way of doing things. If you use a vinyl cap, ignore this step, release your subject completely like you would for a standard cast. But if you do want to try this particular method with a Gel 25 cap, to get the most bang for your buck out of it, do not release the Gel 25 cap. And once that's done, here's how we're going to proceed. We're actually going to apply our Gel 25 all in one batch. But we're going to do that in 2 stages. The first stage, we're going to put on a print coat when the Gel 25 is in that very runny stage. Right after we mix it up, even with the thickener applied, it's going to be fairly runny. And in that state, we'll be able to cover our complete subject and get a good print coat in place. Then the second stage, when it converts to that gel stage, when it starts getting very thick and gelatinous, that's when we'll build up the total thickness of the cast. Now, when you're starting out, you could easily do that as 2 completely separate layers, but you'll find over time that it's a lot easier on the model to do it in one layer, broken down into those 2 stages, because that minimizes the time they have to sit still for the cast, and you wind up with a much happier model in the end of the cast. And then once we've applied our Gel 25, then we'll make our 2-piece plaster bandage shell, and yes, that's my lovely hand-drawn animation of what the plaster bandage shell should look like. Now, for an average head and shoulders life cast, you're going to use between 3 and 4 pounds of Platteville Gel 25. But remember that that amount can change according to the size of your subject and how far down the neck you go. Typically, just a head cast that ends right at the middle of the neck is going to take around 3 pounds. But the farther down you go to the collarbones, or actually including the shoulders, that will obviously increase the amount of silicone required for that type of cast. Now, we'll also be using the Vaseline release. It usually doesn't even take about an ounce of release to release a subject. But again, remember that you don't want to try to mold hair longer than about 1/4 of an inch. And you want to make sure that any exposed hair, any skin showing is released with a layer of Vaseline, and especially on any hair that's present. And we're also going to be using about 1/4 of an ounce of 10 thick silicone thickener. And that amount can vary too, just depending on how thick you want your silicone to be when you're making your brush-on mold. And we'll be using some silicone pigment, which of course is optional. And for a typical full head cast, you're going to use between 6 and 8 4-inch plaster bandages. Now, most of my casts, I use a mixture of 6-inch and 4-inch plaster bandages. There's no right or wrong way to do that. Just the 6-inch bandages cover more surface area, so I tend to use those more on the back of the head so I can move a little bit faster. You'll also be using the pre-made Gel 25 bald cap that we covered earlier, or a vinyl cap. In some cases you can get away with a latex cap, but you need to run a test first and make sure that you have enough Vaseline present on that cap to prevent it from having cure inhibition. Now this is actually a batch of Gel 25 we mixed up for a cast you'll see later on in the video, but I wanted to show you this is a good illustration of the basic protocol of how we're measuring it out and then mixing it for the life cast. I always like to have my A component and B component marked in separate containers and laid out on my workbench, and I add the thickener and the color to part B. And in this case we're adding white pigment and some 10 thicks to that. But it's always a good idea to have those buckets clearly marked so that when you start doing a cast, especially a fairly complicated cast, when you start grabbing buckets, you don't accidentally grab 2 part A's or 2 part B's. Obviously that would be a complete disaster. You don't ever want to grab 2 part A's because that's not going to set up. So make sure your buckets are clearly marked and everything is ready to go for the life casting process. And that's another reason why I add the pigment to the part B. So I always know which side is which just visually. Without even looking at the side of the bucket, I can tell just from looking into the bucket what I have ready to go. Now we're using a 2-cup mixing method, and the idea behind this is to minimize waste and to ensure a good complete mixture of the two materials. By pouring the containers into one another back and forth like that, we ensure that there's no residual material that doesn't get mixed into the mixture properly. So we mix it in one container, switch it to the other container, mix it again, and now ready to go. Now the other thing I do is I split that batch between 2 buckets, and that way myself and an assistant can both apply that at the same time. And by each person having their own bucket, that prevents any wasted time of having to move back and forth more than you have to separate buckets. Now you'll notice throughout this DVD, one of the things we always do is work from the top down, with very few exceptions. And there we have some drips that got onto our model, but she's going to be just fine. But we always like to work from the top down, and the reason for that is I like gravity to do my work for me if possible. So by working from the top down, any little drips can just be worked into the surrounding area. And for this kind of cast, I always like to work with at least one other person. I've done some of these casts by myself in a pinch, but I don't recommend it. Having someone to help you out will make the casting process go much better. Now you'll notice I'm working around her nose area and mouth area. I like to do the surrounding area around the nose first before I come back and do the right around her nostril area. And I like to do that with when the silicone gets a little bit thicker. If you try to do that too early when the silicone's still fairly runny, sometimes you'll wind up finding a lot of drips getting into your subject's nose. So it's a good idea to let that thicken up a little bit, and as soon as it starts to get to that stage where it's a little bit more gelatinous, then you're ready to come back and very carefully work around the nostril area. And this is one of the reasons why it's really good to have 2 people working on the cast instead of one. If you have one person, it's very difficult to do the front and the back of the subject's head and still keep track of how their nose is doing. And one thing we always do on a head cast like this is ahead of time we always work out some very basic signals with our model. I like to have them slap their leg to get my attention if for any reason they feel like there's a little bit of silicone getting into their nose that might be affecting their breathing. And the reason I do that, rather than have them actually touch their own face, is if they do that, if they start touching their own face, they could mess up an otherwise really good cast, and sometimes they might just be upset about a very fine drip or a small amount of silicone that's gotten in the way of one of their nostrils that might feel huge to them, but is actually a really small drip that's very easy to fix. And it's a good idea to explain that to them beforehand so that when they do feel anything interfere with their breathing momentarily, they don't panic. And having a subject that doesn't panic in your life cast is of the highest concern. And on that same psychological note, it's a good idea whenever you're doing a cast like this, remember that people having their entire head covered, or any part of their body, but especially their head and their breathing area covered with silicone can easily induce panic, especially if you don't seem like you're taking their safety seriously. So I recommend, if you're working with other people that have a tendency to laugh and joke a lot, make sure that they cut that out during the time that you're doing the cast. And I can't stress the importance of that enough. It's very easy for someone to panic inside a life cast if they don't feel like their safety is the top concern. So make sure you take that seriously, and you make sure that going into the life cast they understand the importance of how important their safety is, and that if they feel like they're in danger anytime, you will stop the cast right then, because the cost of the materials is nothing compared to the cost of a lawsuit. So remember that as you proceed, and life cast carefully and use common sense. Now back to our application here. You'll notice the Gel 25 is thickening up considerably, and now we're able to start really building it up a lot thicker. And the nice thing about this process is we could build up this cast one of two ways. We could either do this with 2 coats, where we could stop now and let this gel and come back with a second coat, or we can continue to build it up. And here we've mixed up enough silicone to build it up in one very thick layer. But we were able to do that by working that initial stage when it was really runny, brushing that all over our subject's head. And once we got complete coverage there, we were able to come back once it started thickening up and build up a much more substantial thickness. And that takes some practice to do, so I don't recommend doing a full head cast as your first life cast. A face cast or a hand cast is a very good starting cast to make sure you understand the basic material properties before you attempt something this ambitious. Now you'll notice I put a little bit of the Gel 25 into our subject's mouth. We actually cast her mouth partially open, and that's okay. This is a non-toxic silicone, so you can capture an open mouth with this without any kind of issues, safety issues, but just remember that for a subject that's new to this process, I don't recommend an open mouth cast for somebody totally new to the life casting process. Now at this stage, when it's gotten really thick, it's almost like peanut butter. And you'll notice I've switched over to a trowel. At this stage, I can really butter it on, and you can smear it just like frosting. And we really want to simplify our form at this stage. You'll notice how I'm simplifying the eye sockets and around the ears, basically streamlining the form so we have it as smooth as possible. Because later on, we want that shell that we're going to build to come on and off of that as smoothly as possible and not catch on the silicone underneath. And you notice I have a popsicle stick at the ready in my mouth, so I'm ready to switch over to that popsicle stick for some of those fine detailed areas. And that's important to be able to get used to the working properties of the silicone at this stage, because it has a very unusual, almost like really thick peanut butter or hair gel when it gets to this stage. And that's ideal for working in these areas like around the nose and filling undercuts or any places like that. But the most important thing here is that we're building up roughly about a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch thickness. And we're using any excess Gel 25 to fill in any deep undercut areas so that we have a good form that our shell will not lock up on when it's removed later on. Now we're coming to the end of our working time with our Gel 25, so we need to work fast and efficiently and make sure any defects are worked out in the cast. Now one thing to note is this cast was done in the winter time, so we had a little bit more working time than we do in say a summertime here in Texas. So remember that. If typically in cooler working environments you're going to have more working time. Typically Gel 25 gives you a 5-minute working time time at 70 degrees, but if you're working in a hot summer here in Texas, even in an air-conditioned environment, your working time might be reduced to about 3.5 minutes. So remember that. Cooler temperatures result in a longer working time, and higher temperatures result in a shorter working time. And now we're about to that stage where it's unworkable. So we're doing some finishing touches here, smoothing out the outside of that cast. And you can also dip your hands at this stage in some soapy water. Use some of the mold soap and some warm water and dip your hands in that, and then you can use your hands to actually smooth out the form. That works really well too. Personally, I prefer the trowel just to make sure there's no undercuts. And now we're moving on to our plaster bandage shell. And again, here's some of my wonderful animation skills at work. This is basically how it works. There's our front and our back half of the head. Now, prior to getting our subject covered in Gel 25, I lay out the plaster bandages on the front and the back, set up in the pattern that I'm going to use them. And that way I have two piles for the front and for the back, and those are on my workbench right to the side of where I'm doing my cast. And in the middle of those two, I have any leftover bandage strips for the nose. And that way everything's laid out, and whoever's helping me with the cast knows exactly what to grab for which part of the cast. Now, I also have some seam bandages nearby, and the seam bandages are going to be longer bandages that are going to be for actually addressing the seam on the front and the back half where those made up together. And you'll see how that all comes together here in just a minute. But now, ready to move on with our plaster bandage shell. And as we mentioned in the intro where we discussed the plaster bandages, all of our plaster bandages for this process are 3 layers thick, where we've laid them out in advance, 3 layers thick in kind of a zigzag pattern. Even this seam bandage that I'm going to use to start off the mold is 3 layers thick. And then I'm actually making it even thicker by folding it lengthwise. And what that's going to do is actually create the seam, the margin for our mold where it's going to divide. And I'm using that to divide it right down the middle of her head. And then Heather's helping me press that right into that edge and follow that perimeter, what we call the horizon line of a mold, that high point that goes all the way around our subject's head. Now you'll notice that folded edge is facing backwards and that frayed edge is facing forward. The frayed edge, we want that to be forward because that's where we're going to join in all our other bandages, and we want those to feather out and wet out into that each previous bandage made up with the previous one without having any trouble there. And now we're just working, filling in the gaps. And again, we're working downhill. Anytime you're making a bandage shell, it's always a good idea to work downhill so any runoff from the plaster bandage work goes away from your work area. Now, when it's time to address the nose, I always like for all the bandages right around the nose area to be folded lengthwise, just like we do the seams, to make sure we don't have any frayed edges getting around her nostrils, because that can be very distracting or even upsetting for the model to have these little dangly things right in her airway. So you notice how I folded that lengthwise and then pressed it right under her nose there. And that just ensures that we don't have any little threads from the plaster bandages interfering with her breathing. Now we're going to come under the chin there, and you'll notice I've left the nose area open to some degree, and we're going to come back and address that here in just a minute. But right now we're going to work downhill, and at this stage, to ensure that that's really tight around our subject, I like to stand behind my subject and pull those bandages towards me, and that lets me make sure I can feel with my fingertips if there's any little air pockets, and I can push those air pockets out to the perimeter of the cast. And again, we're just working downhill, building up the thickness. The chin area is a part that's going to take some abuse later on when the mold is being opened and closed. So I always like to reinforce that area. And again, we're working down, and by overlapping our bandages, you notice how each layer overlaps the previous layer almost by half. So that means our overall thickness for our life cast is roughly about 6 layers thick. And that's important for a good, strong life cast. You don't want to do it with bandages that are only 1 ply thick. If you do, it's going to take you a really long time to build up the required thickness to have a good, strong cast. So you always want to build it up in those layers where each bandage layer is 3 layers thick. And again, now we're ready to come in around the nose, and you'll notice that we're carefully filling that in and pushing the bandage back away from her airway so that she doesn't wind up having any little frayed edges in her airway. And again, folding that lengthwise to make sure that doesn't interfere with her breathing. And now ready for the crucial bandage right down the middle of the nose. And to do that, I take a little rectangle shape of bandage. And once I've wetted that out in my warm water, I fold it, I twist it there in the middle, and that twist gives it a natural additional bit of support there. It gives it kind of a little butterfly shape, and where that twist is, brings it into kind of an hourglass shape right there on the between the nostrils. And that twist also gives me kind of an I-beam effect so that nose doesn't risk being crushed later on when it's set down on a hard surface. And now ready to finish out the front of the cast. And again, we're always using folded bandages anytime we're creating that perimeter, that edge of that cast. And that's because that'll give us a nice hard edge, and those frayed edges have a tendency to unravel over time if they're exposed and those little strings get caught up on things. So always fold those perimeter bandages. And we're working here with, as we discussed in the intro, just a 5-gallon pail of clean, warm water. I don't recommend using really hot water because it'll get your bandages setting up way too fast, but you want clean, warm water. And when in doubt, keep several 5-gallon pails ready to go, because as soon as that water starts to get too dirty, that can affect the way your bandage is set up. Now we're ready to go ahead and put some Vaseline on our seam bandage, and that was one of the reasons why we put that seam bandage down first. By putting that down first, it's already pretty much set up by this stage. So it's easy to apply Vaseline to it without making a big white plaster mess. So make sure that seam bandage goes on first, and then fill in the gaps with all the other bandages. And by the time you get to the stage where you're putting release agent on that seam, it will be completely set up. And it's real important to apply a generous layer of Vaseline all around that seam. And I usually put it on at least 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide all across that seam. Just like we showed in the intro, you want plenty of that so that you don't risk the back bandage accidentally locking onto the front bandage. And now ready for our seam bandage on the back of our cast. And we're going to do that much the same way, where we fold that seam bandage lengthwise and press that into that previous bandage. Since that first bandage we put down has release on it, now we can push that new seam bandage right up against it. And we don't have any risk of it sticking because of that Vaseline. Now again, once we put that in place, really now we're just playing fill in the blanks. We're just going to work from the top down again and put all our bandages in a row, starting at the top of the head down to the bottom. And like I said earlier, I use a mixture of 4-inch and 6-inch bandages. Here I'm using several 6-inch bandages, especially for that seam. Now again, if you have an assistant, you can multitask at this stage. You'll notice I'm preparing the final seam bandage while Heather's reinforcing the back of the head there. And that final seam bandage is going to actually overlap that seam, where it goes across and actually onto the front half of the cast where it's actually set up, just like the graphic we showed at the beginning of the DVD. And once we've worked that in, we're ready to continue on with the other bandages. And we want to do that seam. We want that seam to be in place and be setting up as soon as possible. And the reason for that is that's the first part of the mold that will have to take abuse later on. So you want to make sure that your seam is in place and it's curing while you're finishing out the rest of the mold. If you don't, if you do that seam last, then when you go to pry on it, it's going to be very green, and it could easily distort and ruin your cast later on. So to make sure we have a good strong mold, it's a good idea that we do that seam first and then work backwards from that point. Now when you're doing a shell like this, using extra fast bandages with warm water, warm clean water I should emphasize again, your working time with these bandages should be about a minute or two, and they should set up to a very hard consistency where they'll be ready to demold, usually about 5 or 10 minutes at the most after you apply your last plaster bandage. So usually by the time I've put on my shell and my assistant and I are cleaning up our hands, we're ready to move on. Once we've cleaned up our hands, we're ready to start demolding the plaster bandage shell. Now again, all of those edges, you'll notice Heather is folding those in half and establishing those edges again across the back. Any place where we have the plaster bandage shell come to a dead end, we want to make sure we fold a bandage lengthwise to reinforce that edge. And that extra thickness gives us a stronger edge, but then again, also it protects us against having a frayed edge that could tear later on in the life of the mold. And there you have our basic plaster bandage shell. And now we just need to let that cure the rest of the way. And remember that plaster bandages do give off heat or exotherm when they start to cure. And that's important to remember that at this stage, your subject has been in the mold for about 20 minutes. So depending on how long it took you for the first part of the cast, they've probably been in here anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And at this stage, because of that silicone mold on their skin, that their body heat and the heat of those plaster bandages will start building up. So you don't want them to be in that mold any longer than they have to be. And speaking of time, remember that extra fast bandages, we supply those on our web store. You want to avoid hobby store bandages or some of the cheaper fast set bandages. Extra fast bandages are what you want to use. I've seen people trying to speed up the cheap bandages using heat guns and hair dryers, and that is very dangerous for your models, so do not do that. Now you'll notice the back half of our mold popped up very easily. Since everything was properly released, we just use our fingers to grab that edge and just pop it right off the back of our subject. And now we're ready to very carefully demold. Now the demold for this is a little bit tricky. Now if you're demolding this and you're using just a standard vinyl bald cap, the demold is pretty simple. You're basically going to slip your hand up to protect your subject and then cut all the way up, as you'll see us do here in a minute, to cut open the Gel 25 and then just peel that off of your subject's head. But in this case, we actually want the Gel 25 capped to stay with the mold. So we're removing the front of the mold and now ready to very carefully demold that. And again, we want to slip our hand up between the subject and the cured silicone material and use your hand as a guard against cutting your subject. Because at this stage, once the subject's been under the silicone for 20 to 30 minutes, they're going to be very sensitive. So everything is going to feel very amplified to somebody that's been in a cast like this. So you want to take your time to cut that open very carefully, and you'll notice that now that because we didn't release the cap actually peels off with the mold. And this is going to take a little bit of patience on the part of your subject. When you go to release a mold like this, any fine hairs will take a little bit of work for those to very carefully work out, like eyebrows and eyelashes. And there you have it. And now we've demolded it, and you notice since the cap came out with the mold is ready to reassemble and now ready to plug up the nose holes. Now for this, I usually, for plugging nose holes or nostril holes, what I usually do is I plug them up with Gel 10 rather than Gel 25. And the reason for that is Gel 25, when you add the 10 thicks thickener to it, forms a really nice gelatinous paste as soon as it's all mixed together. And that's important because we don't want that slumping or dripping into the cast and ruining the cast by getting Gel 25 on the inside of the mold. So I'm going to grab some little globs of Gel 10 and very carefully push those into those nostril holes to seal those up. And I'm using one hand inside the cast to make sure that I'm not pushing that into the inside of the cast and getting excess silicone on the inside. And you do that with both the nostrils, and at this stage the Gel 10, again, that's a 5-minute working time just like Gel 25, but it has a 30-minute demold, so it's pretty fast. And if you need to, you can put a little dab just to seal the nostrils shut and then come back with a thicker layer to reinforce that later on. And once your nostrils are sealed up, allow that to cure completely. And then you're ready to trim up your mold, remove any excess silicone, make it look as tidy as possible, and you're ready to cast a positive into that mold. Now, a Gel 25 life cast mold like this can accept a variety of casting materials, and it can be used for repeated casting. Here we're casting a clay positive where we've poured in monster clay and then back that up with some Ultra Cal 30 with a pipe inside it so we can put it on a sculpting stand. You could also cast easy flow resin or 1512 resin or any other gypsum material or clay materials. One of the main benefits of making a silicone life cast like this is when you remove that life cast mold from your subject, you don't have to immediately cast into that mold. You could cast your resin, clay, or gypsum positive several days later, and we can do multiple casts out of that mold.